Daryl Mitchell wasn't supposed to be playing in this series. He was in the squad, so quite clearly as a backup batter. Mitchell was coverage, the guy that was so easygoing and unflappable. You can just plug and play him into any role in the New Zealand lineup. That's almost his main use as a utility batter. In the form of one squad member, he can cover many different New Zealand players, probably from number 3 all the way through to Colin de Grandhomme's role as a number 7 batter who also wobbles the ball around a little bit.
This is the last knot. My dad told me to say this.
But then Henry Nicholls was out with COVID and Mitchell was dropped into the middle order. And remember that other than a single warm-up game, he had been in the IPL. His last first-class game before the Lord's Test was on the 25th of February against South Africa. He wasn't really prepared, he wasn't supposed to play, and he really should have won the game for New Zealand. There is just something about Daryl Mitchell. At the start of Usman Samiuddin's article on Mitchell, he talks about how he might be the most Kiwi player ever. And it's kind of a fair question, but also a very crowded field. So I've made this handy checklist. Is he underrated? Well, yes. It took him 210 games of domestic cricket to actually get an international call-up. Really, until his World Cup heroics in the semi-final, he was still just seen as just another New Zealand all-rounder. Even now, after seeing his last 200s, I'm still not completely sure he's that good. He's just kind of that player that you're constantly not sure about. And yet he almost always seems to make runs these days. He was also almost comically unknown for a very long time. I mean, he wasn't even the most famous Daryl Mitchell in cricket. That was Worcestershire stalwart Daryl Mitchell, who even after New Zealand's Daryl Mitchell played international cricket, Worcestershire's Daryl Mitchell became the chairman of the PCA, quite a big job within English cricket. He was still outshining him. Also, New Zealand's Daryl Mitchell doesn't look that crickety. Put it this way, if you met him on an all-inclusive holiday by the kids' pool and he told you he was a cricketer, you'd probably think he just meant club game. But one thing that is very New Zealand is medium pace bowling. Currently, I'm commentating this series with Craig McMillan and Jeremy Coney. Both batters, of course, but also both medium pacers, or dibbly dobblers, although I probably wouldn't tell them that. Other countries produce off-spinners as their part-timers. The Kiwis are all over slow, wobbly bowlers. I mean, think about it this way. When he was in the team for the first test, he wasn't even the only bowler. They also had de Grandhomme. They just kind of manufacture that kind of bowler. Another key ingredient of being a New Zealand cricketer is usually being related to another cricketer. And sadly here, Mitchell lets us down a little bit. But he actually does okay on a technicality, as his father was an All Blacks player and coach. On balance, I think he gets this one as well, because that's kind of close enough. And the big question is, are you really a New Zealand athlete if you're not related to another one? The answer so often seems to be no. Then there's his utility. Legendary Kiwi player John Reid started as a wicketkeeper before becoming a batter and then also their main spinner. The idea of New Zealand player is to try and make themselves as useful as possible. Mitchell seems to be completely open to that. If you told him he had to replace Trent Boult or Ajaz Patel, you'd see him in the nets, bowling left arm, trying to work it all out. And the final bit is being an overseas player. While England gets a lot of flack for picking players that are not born there, New Zealand's basically also a rainbow coalition. They seem to have a Southern African player coming through all the times, but also a lot of players who've been born in Asia. And then there's the Australians, so many of them. Mitchell was born in New Zealand, but he actually played for Western Australia under 19s. And not only that, he lived in England for a while because his dad was a rugby coach. So you put this together, and I'm not sure if it makes him the most New Zealand cricketer who ever New Zealand cricketed, but it's pretty close. And if I was to make a video about the most New Zealand cricketer of all time, he might not win, probably be on the short list, wouldn't he? But it's that last bit on Australia I want to talk about, because I think it tells you a lot about why Daryl Mitchell is out in Trent Bridge at the moment making runs. It wasn't just Australia that he played in, it was Western Australia with its hard, fast pitches and hard, fast bowlers. So he was trained for pace at a very early time. Then he goes to New Zealand and he starts to play professionally for Northern Districts. It means that just as he was developing as a cricketer on the yellow tracks of Perth, he now had the green tracks of Hamilton. Weirdly enough though, while there might be a lot of green tracks around Hamilton, Seton Park is actually known as a slow turning wicket. Many people think it's the wicket that spins the most in New Zealand. And it may do so, but it's not exactly goal. But spinners average 39 there in first class cricket, but you certainly face the turning ball a lot. And early on, that was a big problem for Mitchell. perhaps because of his development. That means that Mitchell has had the kind of development that most players don't really get. And on top of that, he wasn't even chosen when he was young, so he had plenty of time to work out his game. He just spent years getting better and better. And it's also good that he wasn't chosen early on, because I don't think he would have made it or been the player he is right now. Those who saw him in that earlier incarnation said that pace was probably never really his problem. He was a very good back player, probably because of the Western Australian thing, but he did struggle a little bit with the moving ball and specifically spin. And you can still see parts of this in his game. His backlift does come a little bit from second slip at times, but he has found ways to negate this, like wandering down the wicket. And he also uses his height to get on top of the ball, meaning that it's very hard to bowl lengths to him because he's always driving. And perhaps he's done that just to make sure he's not as weak around that length ball outside off stump. And if so, it's certainly worked in this series. In tests so far, he's actually averaged more against spin than pace, which, considering his original shortcomings against it, is something quite special. In his only test in Asia, he made a very decent 60 against India at Wankhede, but he was taken by Akshar Patel twice in that match. And it would actually make sense long term that he might struggle with the ball spinning away more, and that's because of his bat path coming from that weird angle. But to get over it, he launches down the ground with a lot of power, which obviously makes spinners uncomfortable. And he also reverse sweeps to annoy them as well. In fact, the more I think about Mitchell, the more I see a player who completely knows his game. He almost always seems to know how he's going to score. And if you bowl an annoying length, he gets on top of it to drive. And if you go short, he pulls. If you toss it up, he'll come down the wicket. Or if you're making things hard for him, he'll start to reverse you. He's willing to come down the wicket to quicks to upset their length, and he sometimes shuffles outside off stump to negate the LBW as well. This might actually sound like he's not in control and he's just trying everything he can, or that he has some sort of scattered mind. But I think it's the opposite. He keeps choosing the right options, and when he does it, there's no panic or a thought that he's unsure. He simply thinks and then executes very well over and over again. And it's that unflappability that we saw in the last T20 World Cup when they made him open the batting, which was such a bizarre thing as he'd never done it before, and New Zealand actually had other openers available to him and they decided to go with him. And of course it worked. It worked so well that he helped them get into the final. And it feels like there is no job Mitchell wouldn't do if asked. Knit Gary Stead a sweater? Sure. Write erotic haikus for Neil Wagner? Done. Compose an email to Kane Williamson without using the phrase, "Hope you're well"? I'll do it. Daryl Mitchell wasn't supposed to be opening the batting at that World Cup. He wasn't supposed to be playing in this series. He wasn't supposed to be this good against spin. He wasn't supposed to be anything more than a decent batter with some handy medium pace backing him up. And yet, right now, midway through his 11th test, he's averaging 54, and he saved New Zealand at Lord's and made Stuart Broad and Jimmy Anderson look far older than they actually are here at Trent Bridge. You might think, well, obviously this won't last and he'll be tested more and more as his career goes on, that he's just in some good form. You might be right, but he was quite obviously never supposed to be like this anyway. Even if Daryl Mitchell does go back to being a regular human test player and struggling like everyone else, that we are seeing an incredible peak from a late blooming all-rounder that was in the team almost accidentally, started his career so late, is remarkable. Daryl Mitchell kind of looks like a player who's not built to surprise anyone, and yet is a player who seems to surprise everyone.